Inquiries into the Possibility of Games and Art. Part 2. Games and Galleries. The concept of the game in relation to art. The concept of a game is simple. It has an aim, it has a condition of success or failure, and it has a specific form of achieving the aim regardless of how open that form is, and, above all, it must be fun. No one plays a game that is a mere chore. At face, this is the obvious objection to a concept of games as art. The fact that games as games must be fun, must be entertaining in a particular way, is already setting the difference starkly. Art, too, must entertain. We would not engage it if it did not. But its entertainment is of the broadest, the most general as generative kind. Art entertains not only through fun, but through the desire we have to see where it goes. To be entertained by an artwork is to be enraptured by its own development and carried with it to its end. And this can be sad, tense, terrifying, meandering, and so on and so on. The purpose and object of art is beauty, but the purpose of games is entertaining challenge, which is fun. A video game with a good story, good music, good visuals, good acting, etc., is no good if the game is not fun. To gamify a narrative so that a developer has an excuse for the player to do something to keep them from being bored is necessary. Yet most often this has no aesthetic meaning and is simply a challenge presented for the sake of having a challenge to beat. This is in line with the concept of games, but it is not in line with the concept of an artwork, where developmental progression is nothing at all amenable to games or the contingencies of gameplay, and thus why so many games hailed as artworks must revert to traditional visual arts like cinematography to advance highly significant moments where gameplay simply cannot interject itself without appearing as jarring in relation to the content. We shall ignore this for the moment, however, since it is not immediately of relevance to the topic of interest: games and play. Now, a game is not necessarily a competition between players, though the vast majority of games before the home console era were of this kind, whether it be competing with oneself, breaking one's own records, or with another. It's not until the advent of video games that the single player story game came to massive prominence and made popular by the very concept of beating a game definitively and with finality. All games can in principle be beat, although not all games are beat as games, since often victory is over the competition of other individuals and not the game itself. One does not beat the game of soccer, one beats the opposing team. One, however, does beat Super Mario 3, and there is no ambivalence about it. Games are meant to be mostly fun, but if we take them as something true, we can see that they manifest in themselves a process of overcoming obstacles. This is the fundamental concept of games: overcoming, and at their best and highest, self overcoming. Games are ultimately self imposed limitations which are to be overcome for the mere pleasure of overcoming. Thus, they share in the being of free activity. Games can even have meaning, but it is not primarily aesthetic despite being representational. What games are popular, what becomes a national pastime, is a highly meaningful determination of the spirit of a time. That soccer is the biggest game in the world reveals in the game's nature itself what the state of social consciousness is. That American football is the biggest game in the United States reveals to us what the US spirit is through the game itself. For in the way a game is played, the how of rules of operation, and the way the elements of the game come together, players and teams and so on, manifest this spirit. Games as such engage a human activity of freedom and do not merely present or represent it, and this is something they add that traditional forms of art do not have. If games are art in any sense, they are only so by stepping into the interactive consideration of art and critic. The question of whether the interaction of art and critic itself is artistic, however, is something highly questionable. Perhaps after the fact, such interaction may become artistic as being portrayed as a piece itself, but in the interaction itself, there seems to be no art. This problem of interaction, the problem of whether interaction which threatens to inject contingency into an artwork can itself be maintained as necessary entirely throughout the artwork to its conclusion without losing the unity of the artwork's concept, is unavoidable. It is also unavoidable that gameplay fundamentally has a different mode of subjective relation than aesthetic appreciation does. In gameplay, we are acting, doing things, making things happen, or reacting, but in aesthetic appreciation, we are contemplating, that is, observing the artwork and doing nothing to it while we grasp its thought. Virtual galleries and theaters. The video game, in particular, is a form which is capable of taking into itself all of the past forms of gameplay prior to it, as well as all of the forms of art known to date. And thus, even if gameplay were not art, video games are at the very least a new medium of encountering art, which admittedly is nothing unique, since art is encountered everywhere more or less. Beyond the play and film, games may be said to allow a more accessible way of perceiving or presenting art through their element of free movement through space, a movement which gives one a new kind of view of things, as well as a possibility of interacting with the objects of the world to extents not possible in real material existence. But this freedom of interaction, representation, and movement is not the contribution of the game. It is a freedom introduced by three-dimensional virtual space, a virtual form of the space of gallery or theater. We can speak of interactive plays or films without ever speaking of gameplay. That is, no game is being engaged even if action is engaged. In the case of galleries, however, the interaction itself is planned and dictated. The room is meant to give a certain feel, the colors, the acoustics, etc., are all there to be experienced and acted with in a very specific way so that the intended experience and concept is conveyed. All that the freedom of movement in space does is to open up the possibility of multi-layered determinations, in which now it is not one single frame of view in a fixed position that can reveal all that is meaningful. In this spatial opening, one must now move to see everything the art piece is meant to convey, but this is possible outside of video games already. One may be tempted here to bring up the analogy of theater and games. The gamer as actor in the play of the narrative. This is a quite intuitive and now significantly spread conception of how games can be art. The problem is that the analogy does not work. A player in a game is not acting as anyone and need not act in such a manner at all. All that a player is fundamentally required and demanded to do within any game, no matter how story driven, is to play the game part and leave the rest to the already crafted artistic elements. The player need not act out emotions, need not act out any choices, need not convince any critic that they are the character they are supposedly presenting. No, the player is not acting nor enacting anything. The playing of a game, then, can be neither an artistic activity nor an artistic object itself if the measure is not that of an actor in a play. The player cannot even be deemed a stunt actor, for there is no choreography they must adhere to. In any game, anyone can win by any means necessary, no matter how out of character and irrational the path of action actually is. Gone Home was released last decade and caused a short-lived yet intense debate in the so-called video game community over the very question of what a game is. The issue centered on the fact that Gone Home was, in the eyes of the traditional gaming community, a glorified, barely interactive story which had nothing to do with games other than sharing a virtual three-dimensional acting medium. One could not win or lose in Gone Home. One could only discover more. Those who argued that it is a game did so precisely around the fulcrum of this activity of searching and progressive discovery, saying that the need to investigate in order to advance into new areas of the house or to grasp the story was minimally satisfying the structure of what one calls gameplay. If a line maze puzzle is a game, why is Gone Home not one too? Well, the obstacles of Gone Home are no more obstacles than reading the next chapter of a book can be considered an obstacle. With line maze, we see the goal and have many paths of interaction which can lead to a success or failure. Yet with Gone Home, the whole point is that we do not know the aim. We are merely exploring and discovering and being led along by the gallery's structure to come upon what is intended. More can be said about the concept of action in galleries, but that is perhaps another post. What the Gone Home controversy brought to light was the common confusion of the word game in our social lexicon, but eventually it was generally accepted that it made little sense to call Gone Home a game, and they are now generally called walking simulators. The confusion of game, gameplay, play, fun, and joy is actually enlightening with regard to the issues that lead to the conceptual confusions, which make people believe they are justified in claiming that games are art, but that shall be another post.